Hypes, students, prepare yourself for your super mega module 21 lecture. Oh man, does this cover a lot of stuff. We're going through things that are toxic, disease, we're getting into water pollution and waste management. This is a whole lot of stuff, so let's just get into it, shall we? I'm sharing my screen, right? Yes, I am. I am. All right. Here we go. So, table of contents here. We're first going to start talking about toxicity and something called LD50. I'll define that for you. And then the super exciting topic of risk management and identifying risk and responding to them appropriately. We'll look at biological hazards, which we're gonna, which is basically disease, and then chemical hazards. So those are chemicals that can cause different maladies. Then we'll talk about different aspects of water pollution. Water pollution is something we've touched on in other units, so we'll try to talk specifically about the things we haven't covered, so we're not too redundant. And then finally, we talk about waste management, which is what we do with our trash. First topic here is about toxicity. What are toxins? Well, theoretically, anything can be a toxin. Like even water becomes toxic at a certain point. Even sugar becomes toxic at a certain point. Like if you ate so much sugar, eventually the sugar would kill you. Like eventually that would happen. But of course, it would take a lot of things to do that. So some things are, of course, far more toxic than others. So we got something that can be categorized as super toxins, and that would be like maybe nerve gases, botulism. Some mushrooms have these incredibly toxic things. Other extremely toxic things, potassium cyanide. That's what we're told in spy movies, that the spies have like a little pill of in the back of their molar in case they get caught. Heroin, extremely toxic. Nicotine, pure nicotine is incredibly toxic. Look at this average lethal dose, about a teaspoon of nicotine. If you had pure nicotine, that would end you. And then we, kind of go on down the line into things that become eventually basically non-toxic, where we're getting into like water and glycerin and table sugar. So anything can be toxic, but of course, some things are far more toxic than others. Now, how do we determine toxicity? Well, dose matters. How much of it matters? So that's the first thing. Just like a teeny tiny bit of nerve gas would kill you, but it would take like an awful lot of of like sugar to kill you. Um, but toxicity also depends on the size of the organism. In general, the larger the organism, the harder it is to kill. So like for any given toxin, like I would be harder to kill than my 3-year-old son because I weigh 6 times as much as him. So it would, it might not be a completely proportional thing, might not take 6 times as much of a toxin, but generally bigger things that have more biomass, it takes more of some poison to kill it. The time of exposure, if you're exposed to a toxin for a very short period of time versus a very long period of time, that will change the toxicity of it. The age of the organism when exposed to the toxin, and that's not the exact same thing as weight, as the size of an organism. Although, obviously, of course, when you're older, your adult organisms are going to be larger than than developing organisms. But it can still affect things depending on like where you are developmentally. A toxin might impact you differently, so age can matter as well. And then solubility of a chemical. If things can dissolve in water, that tends to make them more dangerous because they can spread around your body very, very quickly if they are soluble in water. Where maybe solids would be, they're more difficult to spread around one's body. Your exposure like might be more localized than if something's soluble in liquid. So all those are factors that can affect the toxicity of something. In terms of responses to a toxin, we have two general responses that we'll classify as acute and chronic response. An acute response is a response that is nearly immediate And you have a very quick and often very severe reaction to something. So for example, like hydrogen cyanide, if you take a bunch of hydrogen cyanide, it will kill you very quickly. It won't take very much time. A chronic response is something that you have to be exposed to multiple times, oftentimes over many years, and be exposed to not just like multiple brief exposures, but multiple long exposures. Great example of this is asbestos. And people who lived in buildings with asbestos, if they lived in that building for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, or spent a lot of time working in that building, that would start to cause these chronic lung conditions, lead to things like mesothelioma and lung cancer. But it takes a long time to happen, and it takes a long period of exposure, and that is a chronic response. An acute response, if you survive it, is actually more likely to not leave a lasting impact. Like you can have an acute response, but then maybe once you overcome that response, you'll kind of be back to normal. For a chronic response, that's much less likely to be the case. If you have something that you've been exposed to over a very long period of time and it's now caused a response in your body, some negative medical outcome, that is not likely to go away easily, and those can become permanent and chronic conditions. Different types of responses to toxins. So we got a couple graphs that I want to look at here. First off, we have the no threshold and the threshold response. The thing to point out here is that in the no threshold response, we start to see a response at any tiny dose. So like the minute you're exposed to some toxin, you begin to see a response. However, with a threshold response, you might not see any effect at low doses of the toxin. It's only after you reach a certain threshold that you begin to see an effect. So notice here the y-axis is effect, very general y-axis, and x-axis is dose. And as we move along the y-axis here, when we see this threshold response, we see no effect, no effect, no effect, no effect until we get right here. And right here must be our threshold. And when we cross that threshold, now we start to see an effect. So that's the difference between no threshold and a threshold response. Now over on this graph, we also have two different types of response curves. We have linear responses, which is when the effect increases proportionally to the dose. So you can predict based on the dose what the effect will be. It's a linear response. This other curvy line shows a nonlinear response. And the curve for nonlinear response will generally be a very low effect with low doses. But as the dose increases, you start to see an exponential increase in the effect. And so that increase, the effect starts to increase disproportionate to the dose increase with this exponential curve right here. And eventually you'll see like the dose response level out, because eventually the effect is death, and like that's the end of the effects. So the nonlinear dose response will generally show this S curve, which is low response, and then as you reach certain levels of dose, a rapidly increasing effect, and then death, which is the end. There's no further response than that. The most common toxicity curve is a nonlinear threshold response. That's most things. Like if you think like most things like you might think of as a toxin, like let's use cyanide as an example. Cyanide exists in apples, especially in apple seeds. Now, should you not eat apples? No, you'll be fine. If you were to eat like 300 crushed up apple seeds, yeah, you might have a problem, but you're not an insane person, so you won't do that. Arsenic is another one. Arsenic also exists naturally in apples. Arsenic is a poison, can kill you, but the arsenic that is in apples is well below the threshold for a response. So those are two good examples. Apples contain both cyanide and arsenic, but they're well below the threshold response, so you don't have to worry about it. It's not something you should be concerned about. Just don't go collecting apple seeds and eating giant mouthfuls of them, because that actually could kill you. How do we measure toxicity? One of the tools is to measure something called an LD50. LD stands for lethal dose, and 50%, or sorry, the 50 means 50% of the population. So LD50 is, what is the average lethal dose for 50% of a population? And that is a good way to determine the toxicity of something, right? Because if the LD50 is a very low dose, that means the thing's pretty toxic. If it takes very little of something to kill 50% of a population, that's quite a toxic thing. Whereas like for table sugar for humans, the LD50 is like, I don't know, I'm just making it like 10 pounds of sugar, something like that. I don't know, but some insanely high number. And so that would tell us, because the LD50 is so high, that that's not a particularly toxic chemical. How do we determine LD50? So this is a skill that you're gonna need to have, because you might be shown a graph and you have to determine the LD50 here. The graph here is plotted in green, and this is the dose response of salt on radish seeds. So what we try to determine is, what's the LD50 for salt on radishes, okay? So notice when we are talking about LD50, we have to identify the toxin. Here, it's salt. And we have to identify the population. Here, it's radishes. Because if we change one of those things, the LD50 changes. The LD50 on for salt on mice would be very different than for radish seeds. So we always have to specify the toxin and the population we're talking about. So if you're given a graph, look at the green part here. There's our curve. It's showing this nonlinear response. First, you want to find 50% mortality on the y-axis. The y-axis here is ungerminated seeds. If it's ungerminated, it means we killed it. So ungerminated seeds there. So I've gone in and I've drawn that red line going across right at 50%. And what you want to do is identify where the graph, the line in green, crosses that 50% mortality. And it's right there. So that's where the graph crosses 50% mortality. And then you draw a line straight down from that point. That's my blue line right here. Draw it down to the y-axis and see what value it hits at. So I would say that like the LD50 here is about, somewhere about 2.5 grams per liter of salt is the LD50 for on radish seeds. And so that's like, that's a skill you should be able to have, to be able to identify the LD50 from a graph. Okay. Oh, sorry, I wanted to go back here real quick, because look, this shows LD50 and see how it's per kilogram of body weight. So this is like, so milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So if something that weighs 1 kilogram would take less than 5 milligrams of nerve gas to kill it. But you and I weigh something, you know, we weigh something, oh, let's call it like 80 kilograms or something like that. And so because we are larger, it takes more of this toxin to kill us. And that's where mass comes into play. And that's why you need to specify what population you're talking about, because the LD50 on mice is going to be different than humans. Now, a good question is like, how do we know what the LD50 on humans is? Have we like taken a whole bunch of codeine and just like given human beings codeine until half of them died? Well, there are some dark periods in history in which we have done pretty messed up stuff like that, but in general, no, we don't do that. But we do that to like mice and insects and sometimes primates and rabbits and things like that. And we do that to lab animals. Like we've killed a lot of things to try to determine the toxicity. And we will use that information on, let's say, mice and extrapolate that out to humans. A mouse might weigh 1 kilogram. So if this much of nerve gas kills a 1 kilogram mouse, how much do we think would kill an 80 kilogram human? We extrapolate it out. So, we haven't done too many tests, just like giving people poisons until they die. We'll take lab data from testing on animals and extrapolate that out to humans. Okay, zoom forward again here. So there's our toxicity. Now, we're going to get into risk management. What kinds of risks do we face? Well, toxicity, what we just talked about, is one of the risks, but there are a whole bunch of other risks. So some of these toxins, those might be considered chemical risks, but there's a lot of other stuff. There are cultural risks that we face. There's lifestyle choices that we make that increase our risk. There's biological risks that we face. This graph always kind of amuses me because it shows, this is sort of a weird way to look at it, but it's basically like, what this is trying to say is, if there were no poverty in the United States, how would that change life expectancy? And what this is saying is that being poor is the riskiest thing that you can be. That poverty is shortening life expectancy by about 7 to 10 years. So if poverty were eradicated in the US, American life expectancy would be like 7 to 10 years greater. What always kind of amuses me is number 2 here. If there were, evidently, I don't know how they get, anyway, if there were, being male is the second riskiest thing you could be. So like men have shorter life expectancies than women. And depending on the country, it can be like substantially shorter. I think in the US, it's like 4 to 5 years or something like that. But men also create risks that shorten the lives of others. There's like, there's kind of a odd thing that happens. Look at, there's another one that's unmarried. Being single shortens your life a lot, but there's a fascinating caveat to that. Being married extends male life expectancy by a lot, but being married appears to shorten female life expectancy by a little bit. Still on net, because the benefit to men is much greater than the detriment to women. So like being married does increase life expectancy, but it's sort of an amazing thing that that women are slightly better off without men, and men are like way better off with women. So why do males die sooner? Well, generally because we're dumber. We engage in much riskier behavior. We are more likely to die in car accidents. We're more likely to drink and smoke more, stuff like that. That shortens our life expectancy. There's also some occupational things that men are more likely to work in, and professional fields that are riskier, like construction or industrial manufacturing or things like that, and be exposed to things that lead to premature death. See smoking there, being overweight, all these things. So like if alcohol was outlawed again, if we went back to prohibition, that would extend American life expectancy by average of 5 months. And so we sort of like see these things down here. But notice these, like the most risky things, a lot of them are lifestyle things. A lot of them are cultural things that really reduce life expectancy by a lot. So we can break these risks into 3 categories: biological risk, chemical risk, cultural lifestyle choice, and physical risk. So risk is anything that poses a risk to your safety or health, right? So let's like go through a few of these and sort of like give some examples of each of these. So you see like this, right? This is such a disturbing picture in the time of COVID. It's already normally gross, but this is just upsetting now. So if we see this guy sneezing on this poor woman, what type of risk would this be? This would be a biological risk. This would be a risk of spreading disease. So these are pathogens, influenza, Ebola, Zika, of course, COVID, pneumonia, West Nile, all of these things. These are biological pathogens, sometimes spread human to human, sometimes animal to human, sometimes spread by water, a whole bunch of ways they can spread. But this is a biological risk. How about another one here? Unhealthy food. Where do you think this would fall into? This would be a cultural and a lifestyle choice risk. Because cultural, because some places, some populations are more likely to eat fast food like this, and it is also a lifestyle choice. Some people just like this kind of food. It is, I admit, making me hungry looking at it right now. How about asbestos? What would that fall into? This would be a chemical risk. This would be a chemical risk. It's a chemical that we can be exposed to. Now, how about here? These would be like prescription drugs, maybe opioids. We got condoms over there. What kind of, whoops, that didn't show up, that showed up weirdly. What kind of risk would that be? That would be cultural and lifestyle choice things. Again, so like if you like condoms, for example, using that to protect you from sexually transmitted disease, maybe that's a lifestyle choice, but it can also be a cultural thing if, let's say, contraceptives are frowned upon, maybe for religious reasons. There could be some other cultural reasons that condoms are not like, you know, considered a norm for you for using. Last one here, we got this sweet car. I can't tell what kind of car it is. I'm not a total gearhead, but it's a nice looking car. But look at this seat right here. You see a problem? There's no seat belts. There's no seat belts. These old cars didn't have seat belts. This would be lifestyle choice. You don't have to drive this car. And it would also be a physical risk because if you crash, you're like probably gonna die. I'm like, even me growing up, we used to have this old Subaru. It was a big station wagon Subaru, and the back seats didn't have seat belts. My brother and I would just be, I mean, I like remember this from like 80s. My brother and I would just be like in the back with no seat belts, just like jumping on the seats. Crazy. Today, my kid's got to be in the booster seat, the special car seat, till he's like at least 8. I didn't like wear a seat belt until I was 8. Things have changed. All right. What about risk management? This is very exciting. We need to respond to risks to mitigate them. So you first need to do a risk assessment. What is the hazard here? Is it a physical risk, lifestyle choice, biological? What is it? And how likely is the event? How big a risk is this thing? Like, is the general population at high risk of this, or is this like a really niche thing that not many people are going to be at risk of? And what are the consequences of it? Like, let's think about this from the car seat, right? What's the hazard? It's a physical risk. How likely is the risk to how likely is like the event? Well, really likely, because like everybody drives, so everybody's at risk for this thing. And what's the likely damage? Well, in a car with like no airbags, no crumple zones, no seat belts, what's the likely damage? Death is the likely damage. People just died all the time from car accidents before we made cars like much safer. Then we get into risk management. How does it compare to other risks? Like, is this the biggest fish to fry, or should we be more worried about something else? How much should we reduce it? You generally cannot bring risks down to zero. So what's like our goal here? How much are we trying to reduce it? How will we reduce it? If again, we're thinking about the car, we say like, make it mandatory that all cars have seatbelts. Make it a law that you must wear your seatbelt. Make it a law that all cars have to have airbags. All these things. Those are all risk reduction strategies. We can't eliminate accidents. We cannot bring driving a car. We cannot bring the risk down to zero, but we can reduce it. And then how much money should we spend? I want to think about this sort of flow chart in the context of COVID, because you are living through one of like the riskiest periods in, non-wartime American history. So let's go through this. What is the hazard? It's a transmissible viral infection. How likely is the event? This one's important. We know that about 8% of Americans have had it. That's positive tests. But we think the true number is closer to like 22% because there's probably been so many people who were asymptomatic and never got tested and never actually knew that they had it. So there are a lot of people, and some models are showing that the number is closer to 22%, which is about 1 out of 5 Americans. We think 1 out of 5 Americans has had COVID, which is a staggering number. That's over 70 million people. Now, what's the likely damage? And this one's interesting. The mortality rate, it's hard to peg because we don't totally know how many people have had it. So we think the mortality rate is somewhere between 0.5 and 1% in the US. Now, the mortality rate, if you were to have gotten COVID last April, would have been much higher than if you're to get it tomorrow, because we have better drugs and stuff and we're like better at treating it. But that's generally where our mortality rate has been. What's wild about COVID is that like the likely damage for some people is 0. And then for some people it's death. And that's like what has made this so unique and why it's actually the reason that it's spread so much. Most of the time we don't have pandemics for deadly diseases because when you get sick, you know you're sick and you self-quarantine. You're like, oh, I'm really sick. I need to like not be around people. It's obvious when you're infectious. But for COVID, that has not been the case. So many people have been walking around spreading it to other people who then die of it when that person who was spreading it had no symptoms at all. And that's what made this one so dangerous. So how does it compare to other risks? One it gets often compared to is flu. So it's a good comparison. So in 2018, 2019, 35 million people got the flu and 32,000 people died. That's not a nothing number. Like that's a lot of people. But during that time, we had no prevention strategies. People weren't wearing masks. We weren't social distancing. We weren't like we were just living normally. And those were the numbers. So we have an estimated 70 million COVID infections and 530,000 deaths to date. And that's with all of these things that we've put in place. We're doing school from home. We're doing all these things. And still, we've had over 500,000 deaths. So like imagine what the risk would be if we just if we just ignored it and we just went about our lives normally, like how many people would have died if we hadn't shut the world down, if we hadn't like shut the country down. So the risk compared to like flu, which is kind of a close analog to it, at least in terms of transmissibility and things we deal with, it's much, much, much riskier than flu. And like there's been like basically no flu season this year because we're all away from each other. So flu hasn't been able to spread. How much should it be reduced? That's something that can be debated. That's a question that has become like sort of political. How will the risk be reduced? Masks, vaccines, distancing, these monoclonal antibody treatments, regular testing, all those things. That's how we're reducing strategy. Financial commitment, again, that's become sort of a political thing. But this is the sort of like risk management, risk assessment that we went through with COVID here. Now, let's look at some specific hazards. So let's look at like biological hazards and disease. In general, year to year, the riskiest thing, the deadliest thing in the world is pneumonia and flu. That kills more people than anything else in normal years. This year is, of course, an exception. where COVID, we see right here, COVID is dwarfing any other sort of disease. Now, notice that these here, these are transmissible diseases, and we see heart disease, cancer, things like that. Those are things that are not transmissible. These are like pathogens, things that you catch from other people or animals or your environment, and those are the riskiest ones. But heart disease actually kills more people than those things. Um, so normally pneumonia and flu kill about 3.2 million people in a year. COVID a year in has killed about 2.7 million people. But remember, this is with like all of the global mitigation strategies that we've been doing. This normal flu number is like with no mitigation strategies. So what this number would be if we hadn't closed down the world is a pretty scary thought. So let's look at different types of biological hazards here. So these are all ways that pathogens can spread. So these are transmissible diseases. Now, when disease spreads from other animals, that's called vector-borne illness. And a good example of that is malaria, which is spread by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are really difficult vectors to deal with because there are so many of them. They are very difficult to kill and control. And they're able to spread disease very, very quickly and very far. Mosquitoes, sandflies are other really dangerous vectors. Tsetse flies are another one. Rats spread plague. But larger animals are kind of like easier to deal with because they're easier to like count and kill if you need to. And then, of course, there's human to human spread. And HIV/AIDS is an example of disease that's spread human to human and can be spread from mother to fetus. That transmission has been made much less likely with drugs and stuff. And in fact, like human to human interaction, if you have access to good drugs, people can control the HIV virus to a point now that they are much like less risky sexual partners. But it's still that was how it was transmitted. It was transmitted through sex and through needles from person to person. And then you have like environmental things. Food and water can spread that. Food and water, one of the main things they spread is diarrheal disease. And a sort of shocking statistic is that diarrhea is the second leading cause of death in children under 5 globally. Number 1 is pneumonial disease. But diarrhea, and when you die of diarrhea, you're dying of dehydration. And this is largely the biggest source is going to be contaminated water. So water generally contaminated with fecal matter, and then food can be contaminated as well. So these are all ways that biological diseases can spread. So how can we reduce these biological hazards? Improve nutrition, cleaner water, better medical care, improved literacy, which improves effectiveness of drugs because people take them at the right times and in the right doses, and then access to and participation in preventive public health measures. All these things are great. They happen when people escape poverty. When you are poor, you will have all of these problems. Less access to clean water, less access to medical care, lower literacy rates, less access to preventive health measures. Poverty is like the head of the snake for disease spread. If you are poor, you are at enormously greater risk for these biological hazards, for this disease, than if you escape poverty, or if you are just born, we're not born into poverty. So here's a bunch of things to reduce infectious disease. But poverty is like the big one. It is the most positively correlated with infectious disease than anything else, is poverty. Now, moving away from biological hazards, we get into chemical hazards, and I'm going to give you 3 categories of chemicals: carcinogens, mutagens, and teratogens. Carcinogens cause cancer, known to cause cancer. Asbestos, benzene, alcohol, all known to cause cancer. Mutagens are known to cause genetic mutations. UV light's a good example of this. It causes skin cancer because it causes mutations in the DNA of your skin cells. And then there's a chemical called azides, which are mutagens also. If we had been in person, we would have done a lab that used an azide and had a big skull and crossbones on it. We would have worn gloves and been very careful with it. And then teratogens, these are things that are known to cause birth defects. Steroids, like androgens, like, the things like baseball players use to hit more home runs. Those are teratogens. Alcohol, cocaine, and mercury are all known teratogens. We can classify carcinogens into like different groups. Group 1 is like, these things are terrible. We know it. It's well proven. Group 2A is like, we're pretty sure they do. We've got pretty solid evidence. And there we have like anabolic steroids. Red meat, eating a lot of red meat is associated with cancer. 2B is like possibly carcinogenic. And then 3 is like where it's fine. Like coffee seems fine. So those are some classes of chemical hazards. There are a few that I want to point out particularly. So mercury is a teratogen and it's a neurotoxin, which means it messes with your neurons, it messes with your brain. So mercury exposure is linked with developmental stunting, particularly among kids, mental health issues, speech problems, motor skills. So these are all things that your brain is controlling, your neurons are controlling. And mercury can degrade the operational capacity of your neurons. And it's particularly damaging in kids because it'll stunt development in ways that you can't necessarily recover from. Mercury sources are like industry might release some into the water. Coal, here we go, coal again. You can blame coal for everything. When you burn coal, some of that mercury gets released into the air. And then seafood. And this is what I want to focus on a little bit because it demonstrates an important point. I don't know if you've ever heard that you shouldn't eat too much tuna or shark or marlin or things like that they have high concentrations of mercury. In aquatic ecosystems, especially because mercury will run off into the water, top predators have high concentrations of mercury. And this is a phenomenon called biomagnification. The deal is mercury exists in very small amounts in the water, and then let's say some krill goes and eats it, goes and absorbs some of it. And they only absorb like one part of mercury. I'm just going to call like them in parts. So each of these little krills has one part of mercury. The problem with mercury is it collects in the fatty tissue of an organism. It enters your body, but it doesn't leave. Here comes this small bluefish, and it comes along and it eats 10 bits of krill. Each of those krill had one part of mercury in it. Now that mercury has been transferred to this bluefish here. And now this bluefish has 10 parts of mercury in it. Still not too bad. Now medium-sized orangefish comes along and it's hungry and it eats 10 of these bluefish. Now this orangefish has 100 parts of mercury in it. Now the tuna comes along and eats 10 of the orangefish, and now the tuna has 1,000 parts of mercury in it. This is biomagnification as the mercury increases as you go up the food web, and it happens with toxins that build up in the fatty tissue. They do not degrade, they do not biodegrade or get processed out of the organism. They just stay there. And that happens to us too. We can eat some, and our body does process mercury, but slowly. And so you're not supposed to eat tuna like more than once a week or something. And if you do that, you won't get a buildup of mercury in your body and your fatty tissue. But if you eat it regularly, if you're getting sushi and spicy tuna like every night, you will get mercury poisoning eventually because of how it's built up in there. But if you're just like eating tilapia, which is like this blue fishy, you'll be fine. You'll like never get mercury. There's not enough mercury in the lower on the food web. All right. Another specific example we want are endocrine disruptors. Your endocrine system is your are your hormones. So testosterone is a hormone. Adrenaline is a hormone. Estrogen is a hormone, and we all have these hormones flowing around in our bloodstream, and they will bind to different cell receptors, and that causes your body to respond in a certain way. For example, if you're like walking in the woods and you see a big grizzly bear and it stands up on its hind legs and it growls at you, your brain will say, holy crap, I might die now. And so your body is going to release a whole lot of adrenaline into its bloodstream. That adrenaline flows through your blood, binds to different muscle cells, and it allows you to be superhuman for a period of time. Your pupils will dilate, your arteries will constrict to increase your blood pressure, your bronchioles in your lungs will relax to allow more oxygen in. And all of a sudden, your blood will become more oxygenated. It will be traveling around your body more quickly so that you can run faster longer. This is a life-saving mechanism. That's like an example of what hormones do. They also do a whole bunch of other stuff. They trigger like reproductive responses. So like, when when animals go through sexual maturity, that's a hormone response, things like that. Now, some chemicals mimic hormones. So if you get exposed to something like, let's say, that mimics estrogen, now your body feels like you're being flooded with estrogen, and your cells will now respond like they're being flooded with estrogen. That's going to create a different biological response that can be problematic. There's also some chemicals can actually block hormone receptors. So in this case, it doesn't allow your natural hormones to interact with the cells. So like if there were an adrenaline blocker and the bear is coming after you, but your cells cannot receive the adrenaline hormone, you would not have that like fight flight response, and you'd get tired real quickly and the bear would catch you and you'd die. One in particular we need to know about is BPA, bisphenol A. This is an endocrine disruptor that mimics estrogen. And this is something that we used a lot in plastics, water bottles, baby bottles, and in the lining of cans of food. We use BPA. And sometimes you can see things now, like if you happen to have your personal water bottle next to you, look at it, and I bet you can find a little thing that says BPA free. It's linked with neurological effects in children and problems with prostate development in young boys. This is because it's mimicking estrogen. So it's messing with a young boy's sexual development. Estrogen is like a female reproductive hormone. And so if your body is sort of flooded with it, the male reproductive development process will be messed with. And so we have like these things for what does it do to humans and what does it do to lab animals. We've messed with it a lot with lab animals, and we've seen altered play and like sexual behaviors. And we have all been exposed to it. It was because children are more susceptible to it. It was banned from baby bottles, so it's illegal to make like a bottle that has BPA in it, but it's still used as a liner in canned food. It's not completely outlawed, so BPA is still out there, and it is an example of an endocrine disruptor that mimics estrogen. Other one specific case study we need to know are PCBs. These are polychlorinated biphenyls, and these were very common in industry and chemical sort of like chemical industries. It was used in heating and cooling. They were in plastics, paints, dyes, lots of other industries, had a lot of uses. We found out that they were very dangerous carcinogens, and in 1979, they were outlawed entirely. However, they are still out there and we have all been exposed to them. They're still out there because of their high persistence. Remember that word when we talked about pesticides? They don't break down in the environment. They stay chemically active for a very long time. They also travel with water, so they've been spread everywhere in the world, and they biomagnify in the food chain. So there is a lot of exposure to these things, to these PCBs, despite the fact that they were banned. It's a very good example of the problem of high persistence. Just because you stop using it doesn't mean you have solved the problem. Okay, now we are moving into water pollution. So, something that we've talked about a lot with water pollution already is that it can be caused by both is eutrophication, which can be caused by both point source and non-point source water pollutants. We've talked generally about eutrophication caused by point source pollutants, which would be like agricultural runoff, urban runoff, and things like that. We're going to be looking specifically here at eutrophication caused by point sources here. So in general, this will be like some sort of like waste discharge pipe that's entering a body of water. And that would be an example of a point source, because this pipe is the point of entry for that pollutant, unlike non-point sources, which are much more difficult to identify. So we're going to be focusing on the point source cause of eutrophication here. And what we have here is called, what you're looking at is called the oxygen sag curve. Now, before I describe the oxygen sag curve, there's a term that we need to know and understand, and that is biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD. I'm just going to be referring to it as BOD. Biochemical oxygen demand is how much oxygen is required by the organisms in chemical reactions that are living and going on in the water. The important thing to know is that high BOD is bad, because if demand for oxygen is high, that means oxygen is going to be low. Remember, we're talking about dissolved oxygen here, and when we talked about eutrophication, remember, we can get those anoxic zones. So what we're looking at here are anoxic zones that are caused by point source pollutants. So what could be a point source that could have high oxygen demand? Well, maybe untreated wastewater. So like, let's say this is untreated sewage that's entering. Well, that sewage is going to be filled with bacteria, and that bacteria is going to consume oxygen. So that bacteria is going to increase the BOD, which is going to drop the dissolved oxygen. Now, this oxygen sag curve occurs specifically in flowing water. See this little arrow here that is showing the direction of the water. And so what we're talking about are rivers or streams. So like a point source that's dumping some pollutant that's going to increase BOD into a river or a stream. And there's a bunch of components here that you need to know. So be sure you're writing down notes for all of these different zones. Here is our point source right there. Untreated sewage, great example of a point source that's going to cause this oxygen sag curve. So we have to identify our point source. Now look here, this spot over here is upstream of the point source. And because the water is flowing this way, down to the right of my screen here, this part upstream is going to be unaffected by the pollutant because the current's going to carry it down. So this is going to be a clean zone. And look at what the clean zone is characterized by. The red line here represents BOD, and the BOD here is low. And because the BOD here is low, that allows dissolved oxygen to be high. If there's not much demand for oxygen, there can be plenty of oxygen in the water, and you'll have good biodiversity here. You'll have a good food chain of fish. You'll have insects. You'll have birds that can live along there. So that dissolved oxygen will support the biodiversity. Then right here, we have our point of input, which I've identified already. Right after the point of input, you have this spike in BOD. See that BOD just shoot right up? And that starts to drop the dissolved oxygen. And this is called the decomposition zone. And it's right at the point of input. It's where BOD is highest and where dissolved oxygen is starting to drop. And you'll have reduced biodiversity here. A little downstream from there is called the septic zone, and this is where dissolved oxygen just like totally bottoms out. This has the lowest amounts of dissolved oxygen, so you'll see very few fish there because they can't breathe. The only things that can live are like anaerobic bacteria and worms and weird fungi and stuff like that. So this is called the septic zone, and it will have the least life here because it has the lowest biodiversity. Now, because this water is flowing, this pollutant is going to start to dilute out. And I mean, you'll see that right after its point of input, the BOD does start to drop a little bit. So as it starts to be diluted by the flowing water, then we get into where the dissolved oxygen starts to recover. It starts to come back up as that BOD drops down, and eventually you get back to the clean zone, which will have the same characteristics of this upstream clean zone. High dissolved oxygen, low BOD. You see them in both clean zones. You see good biodiversity in both clean zones. And so this is the oxygen sag curve. And you need to sort of like know all these zones and what they're characterized by. And yeah, so if you can sort of like very roughly recreate this, you should recreate this diagram in your notes. And if if you have access to this diagram, you'll be able to sort of answer any question about it. Got other types of water pollution, of course. A type of water pollution that we have not talked about much specifically are oil spills. There have been a lot more significant oil spills than you've heard of. I don't know about you, really the only ones I've ever heard of are the Exxon Valdez, which happened in 1989 when an oil tanker ran aground off the coast of Alaska, happened right up here. This was the fault of the captain of the ship. Yeah, he just screwed up. He ran aground and the oil spilled out into this body of water here. And the other one is this massive one from 10 years ago, I guess like 11 years ago now, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And this is by far the biggest one in American history. There's this one in like the Yucatan Peninsula. I've never heard of it, but it's huge. It's a terrible spill. And there are all these other ones dotted about that are like not that much smaller than Exxon Valdez that are really substantial. And I've like never heard of them. But if you look at the time frames for them, we see a lot of them in the 70s and 80s. The frequency of oil spills has gone down. And if you look at this graph over here, this is showing number of oil spills from tankers worldwide from 1970 to 2016. And that you can see the decrease. So like shipping oil through tankers has clearly gotten much safer, likely as technology's gotten better and accidents are less likely to happen, and maybe the tankers themselves are better. So oil spills are less frequent than they used to be, but they can certainly still happen and happened really one really recently, the BP oil spill, which I'll talk about specifically. Now, why are oil spills bad? Well, there are a bunch of pretty straightforward reasons. You'll have pretty devastating loss of biodiversity, both flora and fauna. That's plants and animals. Here you see some sort of seabird that's been drowned in this viscous oil poking its way through. In this picture over here, you see some vegetation that's sort of been destroyed there. Whoop, sorry, I got kind of a screwed up slide here. My bad. Let me fix that real quick. Blocking some of my text. Get out of here. There we are. That'll be fine. All right. So you have loss of biodiversity. It can change the pH of water, which changes water chemistry. Of course, that's going to affect biodiversity as well. And oil has very high persistence in the environment. If you still go to the Alaskan coast, and we are over 30 years off of the Exxon Valdez, you can still find little tar balls that are left over there. It also causes great economic damage. That loss of animals will, of course, affect fisheries. And so that's going to be a huge loss of income for any fishery that was thriving in the area of an oil spill. It can also just damage the property of the fishermen, fishing gear and boats. Oil spills that happen on the coasts especially will really impact tourism, like you can't go to the beach anymore. And then these oil spills can really, because they will kill the vegetation, that can cause a lot of barrier islands to basically erode away because the plants die. And so the roots that were holding those islands together die. And now the wave action can just erode those islands away. And the loss of those barrier islands leads to much greater vulnerability to storms and things like that. So there's, of course, huge damage from oil spills. Now, how do we clean them up? When they happen, what do? We got a few strategies here. None of them are super, but they're better than nothing. Strategy number one, light the oil on fire. This is, it's not great because, like, look, you're just lighting it on fire. That releases all the CO2. It's a ton of air pollution. It's not good. But when that oil is sitting in the water, you really want to prevent it from getting to land. And sometimes just lighting it on fire just to reduce the amount of oil is like a reasonable option. So that's option number one, just light it up. Option number two, using booms. The one benefit to cleaning up oil is that when it is in water, it is less dense than water. Even crude oil, which seems like it would be super thick, super viscous, it's less dense than water, and so it sits on the top. And that allows you to kind of like corral it with these they're kind of like absorbing floaty things. So you see how they've like wrapped up the oil, and that can prevent the oil from, you can set up these long lines of booms to try to prevent the oil from reaching the land. Also, once you have sort of corralled it like this, if you look at this boat right here, right next to it, that boat is a skimmer. And so you can use these boats and you can just try to, like, it's like a straw, it's what it looks like, and just try to slurp that crude oil off the top. That's really the best option for getting as much oil as you can, is to try to corral it and skim it right off the top. And oil companies like this the most because this oil is recoverable and can still be used. Another option is to use something called dispersants. And dispersants don't actually clean up the oil, but they bind to the oil. They make it heavier so it starts to sink. Why is that good? It's good in the sense that it dilutes it. So like the ocean is deep. So if the oil becomes less concentrated and starts moving up and down in the water column, that makes it much less dense and much less able to cause like really acute environmental problems. Some people say dispersants are terrible because like you're not solving anything, you're not cleaning it up. All you're doing is like making the oil invisible and like impossible to track at this point. But that is an option there. And then finally, the last option, and this is like when it gets to shore, there's nothing fancy. You're just digging, you're raking, you're bagging, you're shoveling. It's just miserable. It's just awful. It's really hard to clean up. You have to be in hazmat suits. You just try to get rid of it. You just try to do your best and get rid of it. Sometimes what I think these people are doing, they're trying to like push it back out into the water so that maybe a skimmer can go get it. Like that's one strategy. But man, once it's on the land, it is brutal to clean up. It is so difficult to get rid of. Now, one case study I want you to know, a lot going on here, but the Deepwater Horizon, the BP oil spill. So first, looking at this image right over here. We do deep sea oil exploration now. And that's been good in the sense that it has really expanded our reserves. These are oil reserves that, a few decades ago we couldn't get to. We didn't have the technology to get to. And now we can go, you know, get oil from places that are covered by like a mile of water. It's incredible. So the Deepwater Horizon well was covered by 1,500 feet of water. It's really deep. And then once you get it, then you still have to like dig the hole. So you got to drill even deeper than that. So that's really cool. We can get all this oil and extract all this oil and, amazing engineering feat. Problem is, if something goes wrong, it ain't that easy to fix when you got to go a mile underneath the water to try to deal with this thing. And this thing blew out because pressure built up, some, combination of maybe mechanical failure and some human error, but it blew up and they could not cap it. Couldn't figure out how to get the oil to stop. The oil, remember, is under a lot of pressure underground. And so when these wells burst, the oil just starts flooding out of it. And it's under so much pressure, they like tried to put all these caps on it, but that didn't work because the caps kept getting blown off. They like tried like jamming it with like junk. They tried like literally throwing like tires and old golf balls down there to see if they could like plug it. Shockingly, that didn't work. But that's like the ideas the best engineers in the world had during this thing. This thing was leaking from April 20th to, I'm forgetting off the top of my head now, I think it's some like July 2nd or something like that. It was months bleeding out there. Incredible amounts of it. Over 200 million gallons of crude oil spilled. I think like the final government number was something like 239 million gallons of crude oil spilled out into the Gulf Coast there. 11 people died in the explosion itself, so there was like loss of life. And then the effects on wildlife were really just devastating. There was 198 miles of coastline that were contaminated, stretching over from the Texas coastline all the way to the Florida coastline. So that's an enormous stretch there. Bottlenose dolphins declined by 50%. This type of turtle lost 20%. There are birds that got caught in it, or because of food web collapse, that some bird populations have gone down by about a third. So the effect on wildlife was really, really devastating. The economic impact, 40% of commercial and recreational fishing was closed. Fishermen reported 80% drop in catch. Oysterman estimates a loss of over $20 million from in revenue in the oyster industry. There's also human health problems, exposure to the oil and the dispersants has been attributed to health issues. This was, I don't know, it's hard to rank them, but this would be on the short list of worst environmental disasters in the history of the US. Like the Dust Bowl would be on there, maybe a few other things, but this would definitely be on the short list. The ecological and economic damage it wrought, it was truly devastating and continues to be felt. I mentioned the loss of barrier islands, the Louisiana Bayou, these like barrier islands, these mangroves, a lot of them were completely decimated, and that leaves that coastline even more vulnerable to the hurricanes that come every year. And so, that's going to be an issue that is not going to, get solved, that will continue to show itself. Now, moving on to a different type of water issue, we're going to talk about wastewater treatment. Did you guys ever read this book? Everyone Poops. It's a very famous children's book. This is like the inset of it. The book is called Everyone Poops. It's just about pooping. It's just about pooping. It's a true fact. Everyone poops. And that means that there is a lot of poop to deal with. How do we do it? We do it with wastewater treatment. So here's a diagram of wastewater treatment, but I'm gonna show some notes on here that sort of like show what, the components that you need to know in detail. What you'll see here is there's a primary treatment, a secondary treatment, and then a disinfectant stage. So let's talk about those. The primary treatment of wastewater is the separation of solids. You try to get as many solids out as you can. This is done by screens, filters, settling chambers, things like that. And so you're just trying to get as many of the solids out, and these solids are called sludge, and that sludge is removed, disposed of, can be treated in a way that it can be converted into agricultural fertilizer. That's a great thing to do with our waste, because it is, it's very nutrient rich. And so primary treatment, the purpose of primary treatment is to remove as many solids as you can. Now, the secondary treatment is important because though you're removing solids, this is still quite toxic water. It still has a lot of dangerous bacteria and stuff in it. And you want this water to be as, before you release it into the environment, you want those things that can cause infection, can cause environmental damage, to be removed as well as possible. Secondary treatment tries to take care of that stuff, and this uses bacteria in the presence of oxygen. So you'll have this aeration tank, and they pump oxygen into it so that there's this aerobic, certain aerobic bacteria will break down, will start to like decompose some of those toxins from the wastewater. And so that's the main purpose of secondary treatment, is to use bacteria to biologically break down contaminants into carbon dioxide, water, and other non-toxic end products. Because again, we're going to release this water back into the environment, and we want to detoxify it, remove as many contaminants as possible. So secondary treatment is a biological process using aerobic respiration of certain bacteria to decontaminate the water. And finally, many wastewater treatment plants, most wastewater treatment plants and MEDCs have a third step, which is disinfecting. And this is just like, before we release it out into the environment, let's just disinfect this stuff, make sure there's no bacteria in there that could cause us any problems, no E. coli, stuff like that. This can be some sort of chlorine compound, like they use in the pool to make sure that it's safe for a whole bunch of people to swim in pools. And so you can disinfect the water before you release it. This can be referred to as tertiary treatment. Be sure you know primary and secondary treatment, and then like the final step can be the disinfecting of that effluent, that wastewater effluent. There's one other sort of option for wastewater treatment. And this is using wetlands. These are usually constructed wetlands, so we build them, and we allow, so here's like the input of wastewater, and it'll come into the wetland and the water will filter through, and this is called phytoremediation. This is using plants to absorb and filter toxins. And then when the water gets out here, that water has been disinfected, decontaminated to a certain degree. This, like, just using wetlands on its own would not be enough for like an industrial scale wastewater treatment, but this can be used as a step in wastewater, often like after the final step. You know, when that effluent is being released into the environment, there might be a constructed wetland that they pass the water through before it gets released out into the wild, so to speak. And so this is another option for wastewater treatment, is using wetlands to do what's called phytoremediation. Now, last thing I want to do for water pollution is a specific case study, because our drinking water can be contaminated. I talked earlier about water contamination of pathogens leading to diarrheal disease, and that would of course be a form of water pollution. But I want to talk more about municipal water sources. So this is, you know, water that's coming from the tap and how that can be contaminated. And the case study I want to go over is the one from between 2014 2016, is the Flint, Michigan case study, in which their tap water was really severely contaminated with lead. And I want to go through sort of like what happened there, because it's interesting and really, really kind of devastating case study in terms of its impact on public health and what it sort of reflects about sort of institutionalized racism and social problems that we still have. So this came to light in 2016, where it was found that tap water in Flint, Michigan was said to have toxic lead levels. This picture is water samples from tap water from Flint residents, and you can see like it looks gross, like you wouldn't want to drink that. That color is actually iron. That's not the lead that's making that color. That's iron that's in the water. And that's not good. The reason there's iron in the water is the same reason there's lead in the water, which I'm going to explain to you in a little bit. Now, why do we care about lead? It's a neurotoxin. It leads to pretty severe and permanent neurological disorders, and it's particularly harmful to children. It's really stunts their neurological development. So you have kids who had high lead exposure, struggling with their verbal skills, struggling to read, motor skills, like a really severe impacts on neurological development. It can also lead to kidney diseases and other chronic illness. The worst effects are on children, though. And unfortunately, the effects of high lead exposure and lead poisoning are often permanent. They're not something that you can overcome. So how bad was the lead levels? So nearby Detroit water, there is an EPA threshold for amount of lead that's allowed to be in the water, because we can handle a certain level of it. So like nearby Detroit had 2.3 parts per billion of lead. So when you think of parts per billion, if you have a billion water molecules, 2.3, like if you have, for every 1 billion water molecules, you will have 2.3 lead molecules. That's basically what that's saying. EPA's threshold is 5 parts per billion. So Detroit is below that. The EPA does not want us going above 5. They say that's cause for concern. So the readings from hundreds of homes in 2015 and 16 showed an average of 27 parts per billion, which is over 5 times the EPA's limit for cause for concern. In 2015, Virginia Tech did a study of just the 8th ward of Flint. I don't really know the geography of Flint, but that's a certain neighborhood in Flint. And their worst reading they found at 158 parts per billion, which is really bad. And then they did in 2016, they did a much wider study testing in all of Flint, and they found a home to have a level of 13,000 parts per billion. EPA considers a water reading that has 5,000 parts per billion to be toxic waste. There was a home that had toxic waste coming out of their tap, and as like disguised as drinking water. So the contamination was really bad. There were health effects. This was not good. So what happened? Here's our steps. Flint used to get its water from Lake Huron. That's where Detroit gets its water. But it's a little bit far from it. And so that was kind of expensive because my understanding is that they were sort of like paying Detroit for their water, and Flint has like pretty high unemployment. They had really low tax revenue. So like their finances were not in good shape. So Flint switched from getting their water from Detroit, basically like what Detroit drinks, to their old water source, which was from the Flint River. Now, the Flint River is known to be an extraordinarily contaminated body of water. So, because it's so contaminated, you have to treat that water to make sure it's non-toxic. And what they treated it with is something called ferric chloride. Now, ferric chloride, it's like a form of chlorine, is okay to drink. Like that's not going to cause, in the concentrations they put it in, that's not going to cause the health problems. That's not the issue. The issue is that ferric chloride is also very corrosive to metals. It reacts with metals and erodes them, so that some of that metal material dissolves and goes into the water. And if you look at the corrosion of Detroit versus the Flint River, you can see that Detroit is much less corrosive than Flint, and that's because Lake Huron water that Detroit uses is much less contaminated, so Detroit doesn't need to use very much ferric chloride. Because Flint has to use so much ferric chloride, their water is very corrosive. But again, this in and of itself is not the problem. If you are using ferric chloride, if you are using these decontaminants that are corrosive, federal law mandates that you must use corrosion inhibitors. And that's this molecule here, which is called an orthophosphate. And what this does is it will prevent the ferric chloride from corroding the pipes. So we have this thing that prevents corrosion and prevents the metals from leaching into the water. Here is our problem. Even though this is federal law, this corrosion inhibitor was not added to Flint water. Now, why wasn't it added to Flint water? That's a good bloody question. And that is like sort of the huge, like, why didn't we do this thing that was mandated by federal law, that people, like anybody who's in water management, should know that you need to do this? Was it too expensive? Like, that may have been the reason, but it wasn't done. And if you look sort of over here, this is showing what happens with phosphates. The metal gets lined with the phosphates and no corrosion occurs. But without phosphates, the metals start to leach into the water. This is old infrastructure in Flint, and the pipes that carry the water are lead. This is where lead contamination comes from. And if the water that, some of those pipes were actually copper, and so copper doesn't cause problems, but the issue is the public pipes may have been copper, but where the public pipes end and the personal home pipes begin, those were almost all lead. It's very expensive to change your personal pipes from lead to copper, and it's the homeowner's responsibility to do that. It's barely anybody does it. And that's where the lead poisoning comes from. This was very corrosive water, and the local government did not add these corrosion inhibitors. Here is a little sort of timeline of events, which sort of shows how egregious this was. April 2014, they switched to Flint River as a water source. So that's when the switch occurred. Less than a month later, we're talking weeks later, local government starts getting complaints from residents about the taste and smell of the water. The residents notice something's up with the water like immediately. In June 14th, this is the first like acknowledgement that something's up with the water. So like a month after that, officials advise a boil water due to high bacterial levels, but they never mention anything about lead. It's not clear whether or not they did any testing on lead then. But so what they communicated was like, oh, your water might have bacteria in it, but if you boil it, it's fine. Well, the problem is with lead, boiling does nothing to remove lead. In fact, boiling water makes lead even more concentrated because the lead doesn't boil off, but the water does. So the lead becomes even more concentrated in the water. In February 2015, the first tests were done that showed high lead levels in homes. Several months later, officials continued to deny any lead contamination, claiming that any tests that showed high lead levels were outliers. We are over a year into this, and officials are still denying that there's any problem here. In August 2015, Michigan's Environmental Protection Agency declares water safe by federal standards. We're a year and a half after the water switch. Then independent researchers from Virginia Tech come in 1 month after Michigan's environmental agency report. They come in 1 month after, and they show elevated lead levels not only in water, but in children as well, showing that children are suffering from the effects. And in January 2016, the Michigan governor finally declares a state of emergency over the situation. It was, let's call it 1 year and about 9 months since from residents complaining about their water until like the Michigan government actually doing anything about it. And that is a devastating timeline. Like, how could this have been allowed to go on so long? And this is being held up as a really sort of benchmark case of environmental racism, because here's an important stat about Flint. 41% of Flint residents live below the poverty line. 57% of Flint residents are Black. The question we have to ask ourselves here, would this have happened with a predominantly white population, like affluent white population? And for me, it's difficult to come to any conclusion, but like, no, there's no way this would have happened if it were white people complaining to like the Michigan government, like, you know, that's, you know, predominantly run by white people. That seems, it does, there's no way to me that this can be like a coincidence that like the worst municipal water contamination problem like in this country's recent history happened in a poor, predominantly Black city. Black people in this country are exposed to environmental hazards much greater than their white counterparts. That's true of air pollution, that's true of water pollution, that's true of other environmental hazards like noise and radiation levels as well. And this is just a really stark example of the difference in environmental circumstances faced by Black Americans as compared to white Americans. Okay, changing gears here to waste management. This is kind of our last section of this mega lecture, is waste management. This is what we do with trash. What do we do with trash? We make a lot of it, like a lot of it. So what do we do with it? We got two main categories I want you to know about: solid waste and hazardous waste. And within solid waste, we have two different ones. Municipal waste, that's the waste you and I make. That's the stuff the trash man comes and picks up. That's the stuff that gets picked up from restaurants and things like that. And then we have industrial waste, and that is this waste from manufacturing, the waste from mining, the waste from like all the big industries and stuff like that. Now, let's talk about municipal waste first. Globally, we make about 2 billion tons of municipal waste each year. 2 billion tons. Billion with a B. It's a lot of waste. This number is expected to grow to about 3.5 billion tons by 2050. We estimate that about 1/3 of the municipal waste we generate is not disposed of in an environmentally responsible way. And we'll have a look at some ways that are more and less environmentally responsible. That is a lot of municipal waste, but here is the kicker. Municipal waste represents only 3% of solid waste produced. That 2 billion tons we create is only 3% of the global solid waste. The rest is industrial waste. If we look at our regions here, we probably won't be too surprised that so 2016, that's going to be our most recent data point. Look at our LEDCs: North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, making substantially less waste than North America, Europe, and Central Asia. And then East Asia's got the biggest number, and that's because of China and their 1.4 billion people. So there's a lot of waste. So how do we deal with it? What do we do with it? There are a few things that we are going to look at. So we have a bunch of stuff we could do. We could compost it, we could incinerate it, put it in landfills, recycle it. There are 4 things that I want us to look at. And one is the open dump. And this is the most common end result of waste, is in open dumps. And we'll look at those. We'll also look at sanitary landfills. Sanitary landfills are right here, about 7%. And then we have incineration right here, about 11%. Incineration is burning waste. And then we'll also look at recycling, which is about 13.5% of waste. And this is all, by the way, these are stats for municipal waste, which is mostly what we're going to be focusing on here. So let's go through those one at a time and look at open dumps. This is what happens to the largest percentage of waste, goes into open dumps. These are just fields or holes where waste is deposited and often burned. This is not done in a sanitary way. These open dumps are not like engineered to reduce environmental impact. They are just mountains, heaps of waste. This is illegal in the US and I presume in pretty much every MEDC, but they are very common in urban areas, especially in LEDCs, because urban areas produce a lot of waste, but LEDCs don't really have the infrastructure to manage it. So you see them a lot like within cities or just on the outskirts of cities in LEDCs. A lot of problems with it. The burning of it causes really dangerous air pollution. Remember, these are in urban areas, so it's a lot of people exposed to the air pollution. The open dumps are not lined, which leads to water contamination. So there's a lot of contaminants that can leak through and cause water contamination. A lot of people, what you see here, there's a lot of like the world's poorest people that live in and around these dumps. I mean, some people literally live in the dumps. Like they have their like little, almost like villages on the dumps where people live, and they make their living by scavenging for things that they might be able to sell for materials of some value. And this is like the most common end place of solid waste. Next one I want to look at is sanitary landfills. So these are fancier dumps. About 55% of solid waste in MEDCs, these are in MEDCs, go into sanitary landfills. The sanitary landfill will be much less common in LEDCs. So these are engineered dumps that try to contain environmental impact. And we got a few pros. They have systems that collect leachate. That's our fancy word for trash juice to prevent contaminated runoff. They do this with liners. So remember, these are lined sites. These will be lined with foams and plastic. If you look down here in clay, because clay does not allow for much infiltration, they'll have pipes that are meant to collect the leachate, and so it can be collected in a safe way. These landfills also produce methane, because when they get covered up, the stuff's going to start to decompose, but there's not much oxygen underground. When things decompose in an anoxic environment, it produces methane. Now, a good sanitary landfill can capture the methane and then use that methane, and you could actually generate electricity from it. But it's good to capture it because you don't want it leaking out, because it's a really potent greenhouse gas. Once they get covered up, once a landfill gets filled up, they'll line it over, cover it with dirt, plant some grass, plant some trees, and there are actually a fair amount of like parks that have been created, and you're just walking around on top of a landfill. So they can be converted into other sites. And there are lots of potential sites to make landfill, especially in this country. You get out west, it's a big country out there. There's a lot of places where we could dig a fancy hole and put some trash. Cons of this: it will leak methane. It's good to try to capture, but they will leak methane. All this is per the EPA. All landfills eventually leak. None of them ever don't leak. They all eventually will leak that leachate. And they are also pretty noisy places, and there's a lot of dust pollution. So these are a big improvement over open dumps. Not perfect, but a big improvement over open dumps for all the pro reasons listed there. Now, another option we got is incineration. About 15% of solid waste in MEDCs is incinerated, and we will produce electricity the same way you've learned how we produce electricity. You burn the trash, you boil the water, you capture the steam, you spin the turbine. There's a fair amount of electricity that's created by burning garbage. Two big pros. This reduces the volume of waste by about 90%. So it's going to take up way less space. It's also going to produce electricity. Not bad. Now, the cons are, these are in comparison to a sanitary landfill, these are much more expensive. Landfills are relatively cheap. The ash that remains, the ash that's left over from your burning, is hazardous waste that must be disposed of carefully. And when you burn it, of course, you are going to emit carbon dioxide, but not just carbon dioxide, a whole bunch of other really dangerous pollutants that are in there, because whatever sort of there, there's going to be dyes and paints, and there's going to be plastics and stuff like that. And when you burn it, that stuff is going to aerosolize, go up into the air. So these incinerators cannot be in city centers, because the air pollution they create is too toxic. Now, the other option we had is recycling. Recycling's good. 30% of solid waste in MEDCs is recycled. Good for us. Here you see a picture of a whole bunch of bottles. The pros of recycling are this reduces the need for mining. So like when you recycle an aluminum can, that's a little bit less aluminum that needs to be mined. And if we reduce mining, then we reduce air and water pollution. It's also going to reduce the solid waste in landfills. Big con of it is that recycling is more expensive than just burying it in the landfill. So the sort of cost equation of it is not always great. And another big problem with recycling isn't as great as we want it to be. A lot of stuff that we put in the recycling bin never actually gets recycled, especially plastics. They end up in a landfill anyway, but they just took a less efficient route to get to the landfill and had to be carried by more trucks, which released even more CO2. A lot of stuff doesn't get recycled. And that's something that when we're gonna look at some case studies about that, about how good is recycling really, because it's kind of a bummer. It's kind of a bummer. Recycling is the thing like we've all been learning about since we were 4 years old, which we should do, and we should do it. It's just not as good as we want it to be. One more thing, e-waste is a big problem. When your iPhone is done, hopefully you all know that you don't just throw it in the trash. You can't do that. You got to take it back to the Apple store, and they are supposed to dispose of it in the appropriate way. I don't exactly know what that appropriate way is, but disposing of e-waste per federal regulations is kind of expensive. Because it's kind of expensive, a lot of nefarious companies have been busted taking shortcuts in putting their e-waste on boats and sending them off to generally LEDCs, where they end up in open dumps. This is all sorts of bad. The reason you have to dispose of them properly is because they contain a lot of metals that are quite toxic. They might contain like cadmium, arsenic, mercury, things like that, that are really quite toxic. These toxins are magnified when they end up in these LEDCs because there also happen to be some materials that are kind of valuable in the e-waste. And again, some of the more impoverished people in urban areas often make a living by scavenging e-waste and trying to get the valuable materials out of them. Gold, silver, nickel, copper, things like that. To separate them out from the e-waste, what do? They burn them. They melt the stuff down. That's the plastics, that's the other metals that are really toxic. The air pollution this creates is absolutely awful. The health risks associated with this kind of life is just terrible. Dealing with e-waste appropriately is a growing concern because there's only going to be more and more e-waste, and LEDCs are bearing a disproportionate burden for this type of waste because MEDCs are just kind of like sweeping it under the rug and shoving it to paying LEDCs to take it, and that is not great. Now, here's an idea called integrated waste management, where we had like integrated risk management. And that was like, what are your sort of priorities? You have to like identify the risk, and then you have to like see how you're going to respond to it. We also had integrated pest management, which had these different priorities. This is the first way we want to try to get rid of pests, and here's like our last resort. Integrated waste management, same idea. We have first priorities, second priorities, and last priorities. The first priority is, and this is an acceptable AP answer, make less waste. You know our 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce. Reduce is the first priority. Try to use less harmful chemicals, use less of a harmful product, reduce packaging and products and materials, make products that last longer, are recyclable, reusable, easier to repair. Stop making us need new things all the time. Just make less waste. That is the first priority. Second priority is, we're going to make some waste. Okay, we're going to make waste. If we're going to make waste, let's try to reuse it or repair it or recycle it or compost it. Let's not send it to one of these like end of the line places like landfills. Let's try to find some other use for this product so that it does not end up causing environmental damage. So that's second priority is to reuse, recycle, repair, and compost. And our last priority is like, okay, we've made some waste. We can't reuse it. We can't recycle it. We got to get rid of it somehow. So we want to reduce its toxicity to reduce health and environmental impacts. And then we can incinerate it, use sanitary landfills, bury it in landfills, or release waste into the environment for dispersal and dilution. We're trying to, our last priority is like, if we have to, you know, if we have waste that we got to get rid of somehow, we want to try to do it in the least environmentally damaging and least risky way to human health as possible. And that's our last priority if we make it through those. Let's now talk about hazardous waste. Have you guys ever been to the dump in Montgomery County? It's like up by Shady Grove or something like that. It's wonderful. I love the dump, mostly just because it's so satisfying throwing. You kind of like pull up your car and then there's this kind of like cliff and you get to throw stuff off a cliff and it makes big noises and stuff. It's just really fun and satisfying. But if you go there, you'll notice they have two different places. They have the solid waste place, that's the cliff that you get to throw stuff off of, and you have the hazardous waste place. You can't just throw the hazardous waste in with the solid waste. Certain things you have to dispose of properly. Pesticides, gasoline, paints, fluorescent light bulbs, batteries, those need to be disposed of in a special way. Because hazardous waste is stuff that can threaten human health because it's poisonous, chemically reactive, or flammable. Here are a few examples here. Hospital waste, car batteries, paints, the Ashram incinerators. MEDCs, not surprisingly, because hazardous waste is often going to come from like industry. MEDCs produce by far the most hazardous waste in the world, though here comes China, and they will be the #1 producer of hazardous waste by 2030, it is estimated. So what can we do with hazardous waste? We have, again, excuse me, our sort of priorities, our hazardous waste, integrated hazardous waste management. First priority, as previously, make less of it. Find substitutes, find ways to reuse and recycle hazardous waste. That's always our first priority, make less. Our second priority is to make hazardous waste less hazardous. Reduce its toxicity, reduce its risk. And there's like a big way I want you to know how to do this. And one's called, there's bioremediation and phytoremediation. These are similar ideas. Bioremediation uses bacteria and enzymes to break down hazardous materials. So much like we saw with the wetlands in, for wastewater treatment, using bacteria to break down contamination. That would be like a form of bioremediation. And then phytoremediation is using plants, and that would be like the equivalent of the wetlands. There are certain plants that are capable of absorbing, filtering, breaking down certain types of hazardous materials. So like organic contaminants, willow trees and poplar trees. So like oil, stuff like that, that's an organic contaminant. Well, those types of plants can actually break that stuff down, can absorb it and break it down. Inorganic metal contaminants, so let's say you have something with cadmium or something like that, mustard or brake ferns, I don't know, like those plants. These plants are can specifically handle that type of thing. And so you can use plants to make waste less hazardous, and that is our second priority. So be sure you know these terms, especially phytoremediation. That's a term AP drops every once in a while. Phytoremediation, using plants to detoxify things that are hazardous. And finally, our third priority, the wrong image there, oh well. Finally, our third priority is deep well disposal. This is, I'm going to do this. This is really bothering me. I have the wrong image. I want to fix it. Sorry. Where is it? There we go. It was really bugging me. Sorry. Shrink that down. Good enough. Take it. Sorry about that. It's late. Our third priority, once we have to get rid of it, is to dispose of hazardous waste in a relatively safe way. The most common way we do this is deep well disposals. Like what we do with all things that freak us out, we dig really big holes and bury them. So deep well disposal, so waste is pumped deep underground into like a porous rock formation. So we find some rock formation that has gaps in it, and you just pump the hazardous waste down there. And you try to, you do it well below aquifers to try to reduce water contamination. And this is a relatively cheap solution. And also, if it gets breached or if it seems like it's a problem, there is the ability sometimes to actually retrieve this waste. So it could theoretically, in some cases, be pumped back up if it seems like there is a problem. But the problem with it is that wastes have been shown to migrate. They move. All these wastes will migrate among the porous rock, and there have been cases where aquifers have been shown to be contaminated by these deep well injection sites. But this is the most common way that we get rid of hazardous waste, is by doing deep well injection or deep well disposal. And finally, just a note about nuclear waste, high-level radioactive nuclear waste. This is stuff that is going to be dangerous for like 10,000 to 200,000 years. So what do we do with that? How do we find a site that we know is going to be safe for 100,000 years? Well, we don't really know. And we don't have a long-term solution to this. Nuclear wastes almost all kept near the facility in temporary pools or containers. They are not designed to withstand millennia. They are not designed to withstand thousands of years. We're still like hoping to find some sort of long-term solution, but it is worth noting that no country in the world has built a permanent storage facility for nuclear waste. This is a problem we simply have not solved yet. Trying to wrap your head around like a safe place for the next 100,000 years, I don't know is that's a totally solvable problem. That's kind of it's a long time into the future to try to predict where it'll be safe. So just sort of a note here that we don't have long-term solutions for this. They're kept in temporary storage facilities near the site because we don't have the long-term solution. All right, there's the end of our super mega lecture.